You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
Some monsters don't just kill, they hunt. Maya Reynolds was supposed to be another nameless victim, a girl lost in the vast, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. But she did the one thing no one else ever had. She survived. Her escape exposed a horrifying truth. For years, Robert Kepler, a skilled hunter with a taste for human prey, had been abducting women, releasing them into the forest and stalking them like animals. His game had rules. His game had winners and losers. And until Maya, no one had ever won. But some predators don't accept defeat. Even with Kepler presumed dead, the bodies continue to surface. A cryptic message, a chilling photograph, a shadow lurking just beyond the trees. The deeper they dig, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The game isn't over. It was never over. Some hunts never end, some killers never die, and some nightmares will follow you forever. Subscribe for more terrifying true crime and horror stories that will keep you looking over your shoulder. True crime horror, the hunt never ends. Chapter 1. The Girl on the Highway. August 17th, 1991. Denali Highway, Alaska. The early morning sun stretched across the vast Alaskan wilderness, casting long golden streaks over the jagged peaks of the Alaska Range. It was a lonely stretch of road, miles of cracked asphalt cutting through towering pines and endless tundra. This highway, forgotten by most, was a place where time stood still, where a man could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Hank McAllister had been a truck driver for over 20 years, but he had never felt at ease on this stretch of road. It wasn't the isolation that unnerved him. It was the feeling that the land held secrets, that the wilderness swallowed things whole, things that were never meant to be found. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel of his rig as the radio crackled with static. He had lost signal an hour ago, somewhere between Cantwell and Paxson, and now it was just him and the hum of the engine. He took a swig of lukewarm coffee from his thermos, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. Then he saw her. At first she was just a blur, something moving between the trees. Hank squinted, his grip tightening on the wheel. A deer? A moose? No, too small. Then in an instant she broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the asphalt. A girl. She was barefoot, her feet slapping against the road as she sprinted toward him. Her arms flailed, waving desperately, and her mouth was open in a scream he couldn't hear through the thick glass of his cab. As she got closer, Hank felt his stomach drop. She had no shoes, she had no coat, and she had a handcuff dangling from her wrist. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his pulse spiking as he yanked the wheel, bringing the rig to a screeching stop. The girl didn't hesitate. She reached for the door handle, her hands slipping in panic before she finally wrenched it open and hauled herself inside. "Drive," she gasped, her breath ragged, her voice raw from screaming. "Please, go! He's coming!" Hank didn't ask questions. Instinct took over. He slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward, tires kicking up dust and gravel. His hands were slick on the wheel. He darted a glance at the girl. She was young, maybe 18, maybe younger. Her dark hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt and something else. Something that looked like blood. She was shaking violently, her eyes wide with terror as she curled into herself, pressing against the door as if she were trying to disappear. "What the hell happened to you?" Hank asked, his voice rough with disbelief. She didn't answer. Her whole body was trembling, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Hank looked into the side mirror, scanning the road behind them. There was nothing but trees and empty highway stretching into the distance. But someone was out there. Someone who had put those cuffs on her. "Kid, you got to tell me if—" "He took me," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was gonna—" She stopped, sucking in a breath that hitched in her throat. "I ran. I wasn't supposed to get away." Hank swallowed hard. His mind was racing, trying to piece it together. She had been taken. She had escaped. And whoever had taken her was still out there. "Okay," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Okay, listen. I'm taking you straight to the cops, you hear me?" She nodded, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was still shaking, still lost somewhere between terror and disbelief. Hank reached for his CB radio, but of course out here there was nothing but dead air. He tightened his grip on the wheel. The nearest town was over an hour away, but he wasn't stopping for anything. Not until she was safe. As he drove, he glanced at her again, his stomach twisting. The girl had gotten away, but something told him that wasn't supposed to happen. And if she wasn't supposed to escape, then someone was coming to find her. Chapter 2. A Predator in the Wild. The truck's tires hummed against the cracked asphalt as Hank kept one eye on the road and the other on the girl curled in the passenger seat. She was still trembling, clutching her knees so tightly to her chest that her knuckles had turned white. Every so often, she'd steal a glance over her shoulder, her breath catching at the slightest movement beyond the windows, as if she expected something or someone to appear from the tree line. Hank felt his pulse pounding in his neck. He was no cop, but he had been around long enough to know a girl didn't end up barefoot on an Alaskan highway with a damn handcuff on her wrist for no reason. Something real bad had happened to her. She hadn't said much after her initial plea, but he knew he had to get her talking. They were still a good 40 miles from the next town, and he needed to know what or who they might be running from. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, keeping his voice as steady as he could. The girl flinched, as if the question had physically hit her. She hesitated, then licked her cracked lips and whispered, "Maya." "Maya," he repeated, nodding. "All right, I'm Hank." He tried to keep things casual, like he was just making conversation. "You from around here?" She shook her head. "Anchorage." Hank frowned. Anchorage was hours away. That meant whoever had taken her had transported her out into the middle of nowhere, miles from anyone who could help. "How long you been out here?" Maya swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. "A couple of days? Maybe more. She let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in a basement. I couldn't see outside. I lost track of time." A basement. Hank felt a wave of nausea roll through him. Maya shifted, rubbing her wrists like she could still feel the tight grip of restraints. Her fingers brushed against the metal cuff that still clung to her right wrist. "He took me from a bar," she said suddenly. Her voice was distant, detached, like she was talking about someone else's nightmare. "I was just out with my friends, and then I don't even remember leaving." Hank's hands tightened on the wheel. "Did he drug you?" She nodded. "I think so. When I woke up, I was chained to the floor." Her voice cracked, and she inhaled sharply. "He told me." She stopped herself, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth, as if saying the words out loud would make them real. Hank felt a chill crawl up his spine. "He told you what?" Maya shook her head violently. "He said he was going to take me hunting." Hank's breath caught in his throat. "He took me out of the basement this morning," she continued, her voice thin, barely holding itself together. "Drove me out into the woods, told me I had a head start." Her eyes darted to him, wide and glassy with terror. "He let me run, Hank." Jesus. A sickening wave of realization settled in his gut. Hunting. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something else entirely. Hank had heard stories, old rumors about missing women, whispers in truck stops and bars, girls vanishing without a trace. Some people talked about a man who took them out into the wilderness, a man who knew the terrain better than anyone else, who played a game no one ever won. But they had always been just stories, until now. Maya curled tighter into herself, staring at the road ahead like she was willing it to move faster. "He said I wouldn't make it," she whispered, "said no one ever had." Hank's grip on the wheel turned to iron, but she had made it. And that meant one thing: whoever this bastard was, he wasn't going to let her go that easy. Hank pressed down on the gas. They had to get to the police before the hunter found them first. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Cabin, August 17th, 1991, Paxson, Alaska. The tiny roadside police station in Paxson was little more than a 2-room office attached to a metal garage, the kind of place that rarely saw real trouble. Most of the time, the biggest concern for the local deputies was a drunk tourist or an occasional moose wandering too close to the highway. But as Hank McAllister pulled his 18-wheeler into the dirt lot, he knew this was about to be the biggest case the town had ever seen. Maya sat rigid in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She hadn't spoken much after she told him about the hunt. She just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, body stiff, like she was bracing for something worse to come. "We're here," Hank said gently, shifting the truck into park. "Come on, kid. Let's get you inside." Maya hesitated, glancing out the window as if expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. Hank followed her gaze. Nothing but the endless expanse of the Alaskan wilderness. But that didn't mean she was safe. Hank opened the door and stepped out, coming around to help her down. As soon as her bare feet hit the gravel, she winced, but kept moving. Hank didn't like that. The girl was walking on adrenaline, and once that wore off, she'd crash hard. The front door of the station creaked as they stepped inside. The place smelled of stale coffee and dust. A single officer, a burly man in his late 40s with greying hair and a thick mustache, looked up from his desk. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, eyeing them both. Hank put a steadying hand on Maya's shoulder. "Yeah, Sheriff, we got a serious problem." The interview within minutes, Maya was seated in a small, dimly lit office, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, a cup of hot coffee shaking in her hands. Sheriff Donahue sat across from her, flipping open a notepad, his face set in stone. "I need you to start from the beginning," he said. His voice was calm but firm. "Tell me everything you remember." Maya swallowed hard. She took a deep breath, staring down at the steaming cup in her hands. "I was at a bar in Anchorage," she started, voice hoarse. "I don't even remember leaving, just waking up in a basement." Donahue exchanged a glance with Hank, his expression darkening. "He kept me down there for I don't know how long," she continued. "Days, maybe. He didn't talk much. But this morning, he told me he was taking me somewhere special, said he had a game he liked to play." Her grip tightened on the cup, knuckles turning white. "He drove me out to the woods, miles away. I could hear the river, the birds. I thought maybe he was just going to leave me there." She let out a bitter laugh. "But then he took off my chains and told me to run." Donahue's jaw clenched. "Run?" She nodded. "He said I had a head start, that if I made it out I could live." She looked up, eyes hollow. "I ran as fast as I could, but I heard him following me. At first just walking, then running. I heard him laughing." Her voice cracked, like he was enjoying it. Hank felt something hot and ugly twist in his chest. "But you got away," Donahue said, scribbling something in his notepad. "That's what matters. You're safe now." Maya shook her head. "No, you don't understand." She reached into the pocket of the oversized jacket Hank had given her and pulled out something small and crumpled. She placed it on the table. It was a Polaroid. Donahue picked it up carefully, straightening the bent corners. His face went pale. It was a picture of a woman. She was kneeling in the dirt, hands tied behind her back, face streaked with tears. Behind her, barely visible, was a man, his face in shadow, holding a rifle. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't the first." "The search begins within an hour." The station was buzzing. The sheriff had called in state police, and now there were multiple officers in the room, studying maps, making calls, gathering whatever resources they could. "You said he flew you out there?" Donahue asked. Maya nodded. "A small plane. Bush plane, I think." Hank watched as Donahue rubbed his temples. "That narrows it down some. Not many private pilots in this area, and not many places a plane could land." He turned to one of the deputies. "Get me a list of all registered bush pilots operating out of Anchorage." The deputy nodded and got to work. Hank leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So what now?" Donahue exhaled sharply. "Now we find him before he finds her." The cabin in the woods. By the time the officers set out, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Maya had given them as much information as she could, details about the route, the sound of a nearby river, the look of the clearing where she had escaped. They were working off a hunch, but it was a damn good one. The convoy of vehicles rumbled down an old logging road, deep into the wilderness. Maya stayed behind with a deputy, still too shaken to return. But Hank rode along. He didn't know why. Maybe because after seeing that girl's face, he had to see this bastard caught. They drove for miles until the road narrowed into something barely passable. And then they saw it. A cabin. It was small, old, built from rough-hewn logs, the windows covered with thick shutters. A single bush plane sat parked in a clearing beside it. Donahue lifted a pair of binoculars. That's got to be it. Hank felt a chill. You think he's inside? Only one way to find out. The officers moved in carefully, weapons drawn, calling out warnings. But when they kicked in the door, they found something worse than they had expected. The place was empty, but the walls were lined with photographs, women, dozens of them. Some were smiling, others were bound and gagged, a few were nothing more than remains. And on the table, placed neatly beside a hunting knife and a roll of rope, was another Polaroid. A picture of Maya with a single word scrawled at the bottom, next. Chapter 4. A Body in the Woods, August 17th, 1991, deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The cabin was silent, but the horror inside was deafening. Sheriff Donahue stood in the center of the one-room dwelling, his jaw tight as he took in the sickening display. The photos lined the walls, Polaroids pinned up like trophies. Some were faded, curling at the edges, suggesting that this had been going on for years. Others were fresh, recent, like the one of Maya, placed on the table as if the bastard had expected her to be the next installment in his collection. Hank stood just outside the door, his stomach churning. He had seen some rough things in his years on the road. Car wrecks, frozen bodies found on the side of the highway in the dead of winter. But nothing like this. Nothing that made his skin crawl the way this did. One of the officers, a younger deputy named Carter, stumbled back from the wall, his face ghostly pale. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. How many women did this guy take? Donahue exhaled sharply. Too many. Another deputy was rummaging through a filing cabinet in the corner of the cabin. Sheriff, he called, holding up a worn notebook. Found something. Donahue grabbed it, flipping through the pages. It was a log, detailed, methodical. Names, dates, locations, and in the final few entries, descriptions of what had happened to each woman. Some had been released, though Donahue doubted they had made it out of the woods alive. Others had failed the game. Hank didn't need to read between the lines. The son of a bitch kept records, Donahue muttered, his grip tightening on the notebook, like he was keeping score. Then on one of the last pages a name stood out, Maya Reynolds. The date was marked as today. Next to it 2 words had been scrawled in neat, almost casual handwriting, Hunting begins. Hank felt a cold shudder run through him. Maya had escaped, but she was never supposed to, and now somewhere out in the vast, endless wilderness a predator was on the move, one who didn't like to lose. Carter, radio in, Donahue ordered. Tell 'em we got enough evidence to launch a full manhunt, and get a forensic team out here now. The young deputy nodded, stepping outside to make the call. Another officer, Wells, was scanning a topographical map tacked to the far wall, his brows furrowed. Sheriff, you need to see this. Donahue stepped over. The map was covered in red X's, each one marked with a date. Some were clustered around the cabin. Others stretched miles into the forest. And one was fresh. This one's just a few weeks old, Wells said, tracing his finger over it. Maybe a mile from here. Hank knew what they were all thinking. Donahue set his jaw. Let's move. The grave in the permafrost. They hiked through the dense brush, pushing past low-hanging branches, boots crunching against the damp, mossy ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but there was something else too, a faint, rancid odour that set Hank's teeth on edge. He had a bad feeling about this. Donahue led the way, following the map's coordinates, and soon they came upon a small clearing. The grass had been disturbed, dirt uneven, like something had been dug up or buried, and then the smell hit them full force. Jesus, Carter gagged, pulling his sleeve over his mouth. The sheriff didn't hesitate. Dig. They worked quickly, clawing at the dirt with gloved hands, shovels scraping against the frozen soil beneath. It didn't take long before the first sign of what lay beneath appeared, a tangle of fabric, a piece of a jacket. Then an arm, pale, stiff, fingers curled inward. Hank turned away, his stomach twisting, bile rising in his throat. He had known. Deep down he had known what they would find. Son of a bitch, Donahue muttered, taking off his hat and running a hand over his face. We got her. The forensic team would have to confirm it, but it was obvious this was one of the missing women. another victim of the hunter. And if this grave was here, there were more. Many more. The hunter's shadow. As they marked the burial site and called in more backup, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees were thick, dense, and beyond them, nothing but endless wilderness. But someone was out there. He could feel it. And that meant one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 5, The Game Revealed. August 17th, 1991, Paxson, Alaska. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, bathing the sky in deep hues of orange and violet. But there was no beauty in this moment, no peace, not with what they had just uncovered. Sheriff Donahue stood near the edge of the burial site, his jaw locked in grim determination as the forensic team worked. The remains had been carefully exhumed, the dirt peeled back like layers of a horrifying secret. The victim, a woman, late 20s, based on early analysis, had been buried deep in the permafrost, preserved by the brutal Alaskan cold. They had yet to identify her, but Hank already knew what they would find. She was one of his. The hunter's. Hank watched as Donahue scanned the tree line, his eyes sharp, shoulders tense. The man was thinking the same thing Hank was. If this bastard was still out there, he wasn't going to take Maya's escape lightly. He was going to come back for her. And soon. Maya's testimony. Back at the station, Maya sat at a table, gripping a styrofoam cup of coffee with both hands, trying to stop them from shaking. She hadn't said much since they'd returned, her eyes darting to the windows every few minutes, like she expected him to appear from the darkness. Hank sat across from her, while Donahue paced behind him, flipping through the small notebook they had found in the cabin. "Maya," Donahue said, his voice firm but not unkind, "we need to know everything, every detail, no matter how small." She swallowed hard. "I already told you what he did, how he let me go, how he hunted me." "We need more," Donahue pressed. "His name, his face. Did he say anything? Did you see anything?" Maya closed her eyes, inhaled sharply. "He had a plane," she whispered. "I heard it land before he took me out of the basement." She lifted her head, her face paler than before. He wasn't worried about anyone hearing it. It means he had a private landing strip, somewhere remote. Hank and Donahue exchanged a glance. That narrowed the search. Maya exhaled slowly. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was like he was teaching me something. Like he wanted me to understand the rules. She clenched her fists. He said the others didn't appreciate the game, that they begged, cried, tried to hide. He didn't like that. Her throat bobbed. He said he liked a challenge. A chill ran through Hank's spine. Maya's eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. "He was excited when I ran." Donahue's expression hardened. "You saw his face?" Maya hesitated, then nodded. "Not at first. He wore a mask when he took me out of the basement. But when I fell, when I tripped in the woods, he was laughing." Her voice trembled. "That's when I saw him." Donahue pulled a notepad from his pocket. "Describe him." Maya closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus. Mid-40s, I think. Maybe early 50s. White, tall, 6 foot, maybe a little more, not heavy but strong, like someone who spends a lot of time outdoors. She swallowed. Short hair, light, blonde, maybe greying. Donahue jotted down notes. "Anything distinctive? Scars, tattoos?" Maya's fingers tightened around the cup. "His eyes." Hank leaned forward. "What about them, Vibling?" Staring straight ahead as if she were seeing them all over again. "They were cold," she whispered, "like he wasn't human." A heavy silence settled over the room. Hank had seen a lot of things in his life, but something about the way Maya said those words, the way her voice seemed to shrink, made his stomach twist. This man wasn't just a serial killer. He was a predator in the purest form, and he was still out there. The name of the devil. An officer knocked on the doorframe, clearing his throat. "Sheriff," he said, "we might have something." Donahue turned, brows furrowing. "What is it?" The officer held up a printout. "We ran a check on registered bush pilots in the area. Cross-referenced with missing persons cases, employment history, anything suspicious." He handed Donahue the paper. One name stood out. Donahue scanned the document. His entire body went rigid. "Robert Kepler." Maya's breath hitched. Hank sat up straighter. "That's him." Maya didn't speak at first. Then, finally, she nodded. Donahue let out a slow, steady exhale. "Son of a bitch." Hank peered over his shoulder at the report. Kepler owned a bakery in Anchorage, a quiet, friendly businessman. But he also had a private airstrip on property listed under a secondary business name, a hunting lodge. "How the hell does a baker afford his own plane?" Hank muttered. "He's been doing this for a long time," Donahue said grimly. "He's careful, selective, only takes women no one will miss." His lips pressed into a thin line. Until now. Kepler had made a mistake. He had let Meyer escape, and now they had his name, but that didn't mean he would go down easy. The hunter becomes the hunted. "We need to move," Donahue said, tossing the report onto the desk. "We know who he is. We know where he operates. He won't wait for us to come to him. He's smart. He's already covering his tracks." Meyer clenched her fists. "He won't stop, will he?" Donahue's expression darkened. "Not until we stop him first." Hank felt something shift in the air. This wasn't just a manhunt. This was war. And Robert Kepler had just become the most dangerous man in Alaska. Chapter 6. The Hunter Becomes Prey. August 18th, 1991. Anchorage, Alaska. The morning air was thick with tension as Sheriff Donahue and his team gathered at the small Paxson police station, poring over maps, aerial photos, and everything they had on Robert Kepler. The pieces were falling into place, but time was against them. Kepler was smart, calculated. He had evaded capture for years, but now, with his identity exposed and Meyer alive to testify, he knew the walls were closing in, and that made him even more dangerous. Hank stood near the window, arms crossed, watching as Meyer sat on the far side of the room. She was quiet, withdrawn, staring at the old, scuffed linoleum floor. The bruises on her wrists had darkened overnight. She was safe now. But Hank knew better than to think it was over, because men like Kepler didn't just disappear. They fought back. And this time, Kepler was the one being hunted. The raid, by mid-morning, the FBI had joined the manhunt. They mobilized quickly, securing a warrant and assembling a tactical team. Their target? Kepler's private airstrip and hunting lodge, an isolated, heavily wooded property located 50 miles north of Anchorage, a place he had likely used for years to lure women to their deaths. "We hit the airstrip first," Donahue told the agents. "If he's planning to run, that's his best shot." The convoy of unmarked SUVs rumbled down the long dirt road leading to Kepler's property. As they neared, the vehicles slowed, officers stepping out with weapons drawn. The place was eerily quiet, too quiet. Donahue motioned to one of the agents, "Take a team around the back." Hank stood near the perimeter, heart pounding. He had no business being here, but after what he had witnessed, he wasn't about to sit this one out. The main door to the lodge was locked. One of the agents kicked it in. The cabin was empty. No sign of Kepler, but the place reeked of death. Inside, it was a hunter's paradise. Mounted animal heads lined the walls, alongside racks of rifles and crossbows. But among them were trophies of a different kind. Jewelry, clothing, photographs, and a large, hand-drawn map spread across a wooden table, marked with red X's. Donahue's eyes darkened as he scanned the paper. "We're looking at multiple dump sites." The weight of the discovery settled over the room. Kepler had been doing this for years, and now he was gone. The chase begins outside. A low rumble sounded in the distance. Hank turned sharply. "You hear that?" Then the realization hit. A plane. He rushed to the clearing just as the single-engine bush plane roared to life on the makeshift runway. Kepler was making his escape. "Son of a bitch!" Donahue barked. "Move, move, move!" The officers sprinted toward the aircraft as the propeller spun faster. Hank had driven these roads for years. He knew how dangerous they could be. If Kepler got into the air, he'd vanish into the Alaskan wilderness, where he could lay low indefinitely. Or worse, he could be heading somewhere else to find another victim. "We can't let him take off," an agent shouted. Donahue acted fast, raising his shotgun and firing at the plane's tires. The first shot missed, but the second struck true. The tire exploded. The plane lurched violently, skidding off course, the right wing clipping a tree before slamming to a stop in the brush. A moment of silence. Then the cockpit door flung open, and Kepler stumbled out, blood streaking down his face from where he had slammed into the dashboard. But he wasn't done yet. Even injured, he moved fast, bolting into the trees. "Go!" Donahue shouted. The chase was on. The hunter's last stand. Kepler knew these woods. He had hunted them, stalked them, made them his killing ground. But now he was running for his life. Hank charged after the officers, weaving through the dense undergrowth. Adrenaline burned through his veins. He wasn't a cop, wasn't armed, but damn it, he wasn't letting that bastard disappear into the wilderness. Gunshots rang through the trees as Kepler fired wildly behind him, desperate to slow his pursuers. But he was losing ground. Then the sound of rushing water. A river. Kepler stumbled out onto a rocky ledge overlooking the rapids below. His breath came in ragged gasps as he spun, his rifle raised. "Don't do it, Kepler," Donahue yelled, stepping forward, gun trained on the killer. Kepler's eyes flickered between the river and the officers closing in. Trapped. For the first time, he was the prey. A twisted grin curled his lips and he lifted the gun. A single shot rang out. Kepler's body jerked backward, his rifle slipping from his fingers. And then, without a word, he let himself fall. Hank watched as the current swallowed him whole, his body vanishing beneath the churning rapids. Gone. The aftermath. They searched for hours, but there was no sign of Robert Kepler. The river was freezing, the current strong. Even an expert outdoorsman would struggle to survive, but they all knew the truth. Until they found a body, Kepler wasn't dead. He was out there. And that meant Maya would never truly be safe. The girl who lived. By the time they returned to town, Maya was waiting. She stood outside the station, arms wrapped around herself, watching the horizon as if expecting to see him return. When she saw Hank and Donahue, she swallowed hard. "Did you get him?" Donahue hesitated, then nodded. "We got him." Maya exhaled, but Hank could see the tension still lingering in her shoulders. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not until the body was found. And in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, monsters had a way of surviving. Chapter 7. The Trial of a Ghost. August 25th, 1991. Anchorage, Alaska. A week had passed, but the nightmare was far from over. Despite extensive searches along the river, Robert Kepler's body had yet to be found. The official reports declared him presumed dead, but no one, not Sheriff Donahue, not the FBI, and certainly not Maya, was willing to believe it. Because monsters like Kepler didn't just disappear, they waited. And they hunted. The evidence against a dead man inside the Anchorage Police Department, the war room, had become an evidence hub. Photographs, maps, Kepler's hunting logs and forensic reports covered every available surface. The bodies recovered from his burial sites had been identified, 6 women, all previously reported missing over the last decade. But based on Kepler's records, they knew there were more. Dozens more. Maya sat quietly in the corner, listening as the agents and officers debated their next move. "We need to proceed as if he's still alive," Donahue said, flipping through Kepler's notebook. "We don't close this case until we have a body." One of the FBI agents leaned forward. "Even if he is dead, there's enough evidence here to officially charge him posthumously. We can at least give the families closure." Maya's voice was soft but firm. "And if he's not dead?" Silence. Hank shifted uncomfortably, exchanging a glance with Donahue. The possibility hung over them like a storm cloud. Maya clenched her fists. "He planned everything, everything. He let me run because he wanted to chase me. What if he planned this too?" Her voice shook slightly. "What if the river wasn't an accident?" Donahue exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Then we have a bigger problem." The missing link. That night, Hank found himself unable to sleep. He was back in his truck, parked outside a motel on the outskirts of town, staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't shut off. Something didn't sit right with him. Kepler had been too damn methodical to just let himself drown. If he had survived, where the hell would he go? His hunting lodge was compromised. His cabin was crawling with law enforcement. He had no plane, no vehicle. But he had the wilderness. And if there was one thing Kepler knew better than anyone else, it was how to survive out there. Hank sat up abruptly, reaching for the stack of old maps Donahue had given him. He spread them out across the small table, tracing his finger over Kepler's known locations. Then he saw it. A remote section of land, deeper into the mountains, past the main hunting grounds. No roads, no trails. Nothing marked except for one small notation in Kepler's own handwriting. Hank frowned. Kepler had purchased his hunting lodge in 1982, but this mark, this location, had been noted 4 years earlier. Could it be another hideout? He didn't wait. He grabbed his keys and headed straight for Donahue's office. The forgotten cabin. By dawn, a search team was mobilized. Armed officers, helicopters, and tracking dogs moved into the dense, mountainous region northwest of Kepler's known hunting grounds. The terrain was brutal, thick brush, uneven ground, sheer cliffs, the kind of place no normal man could survive for long. But Kepler wasn't normal, and after 6 grueling hours of searching, they found it. A small, nearly invisible structure nestled between the trees, covered in moss and brush. A forgotten cabin. Hank felt his pulse quicken as they approached. The door was slightly ajar. No footprints, no smoke from the chimney, but someone had been here. Recently. Donahue motioned for his team to move in. Weapons raised, they entered cautiously. The inside was Spartan. No electricity, no running water. Just a bedroll on the floor, a few scattered supplies, and in the far corner a rusted metal box. Donahue pried it open. Inside were more photos, more trophies, and a single, hand-scrawled note. "You should have let me finish the game." The breath left Hank's lungs. He turned to Donahue, who was staring at the note with a clenched jaw. He's alive. Meyer had been right. Kepler had planned everything, and now he was watching, waiting. Chapter 8. The Last Hunt. August 26, 1991, Denali Wilderness, Alaska. The forest was alive with tension. The wind whispered through the trees, bending branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the search team. The air was sharp, laced with the damp scent of moss and decay. Sheriff Donahue stood at the edge of the newly discovered cabin, gripping the note Kepler had left behind. The words burned into his mind. "You should have let me finish the game." He turned to his team. "We need to move now. If Kepler's alive, he's already a step ahead of us." Hank stood nearby, his fists clenched. The trucker had no official role in the operation, but at this point, no one was questioning his presence. He had been there from the beginning. He had saved Meyer, and now he wanted to see this through. Meyer was back at the station under protective custody. She had barely slept, barely spoken, but she had been right. Kepler had planned this. And that meant he was planning something else. The real question was, who was his next target? The tracks in the forest. The search team split into 2 groups, fanning out in the dense wilderness. Kepler had lived out here for years. He knew how to cover his tracks, but he wasn't invincible. Less than a mile from the cabin, one of the deputies found something. A fresh boot print. Donahue crouched down, examining the indentation in the soil. It was deep, recent. Kepler was close. Too close. The deputy radioed in. "Sheriff, we found more prints, leading northwest." Donahue stood, motioning for the team to move. They followed the trail in silence, weapons drawn. Then they saw it. A small clearing, a pile of rocks, and next to it, another grave. The message in the ground. The grave had been hastily covered, a clear sign that Kepler had buried someone here not long ago. The team worked quickly, digging through the soft dirt, the sickly scent of decay rising into the cold air. And then the body surfaced. A woman, young, likely in her early 20s. Her wrists were bound, her face frozen in terror, and carved into the tree above her grave. Meyer should have been next. Hank's stomach twisted. This wasn't just another victim. This was a warning. The phone call back at the station. Meyer sat curled in a chair, wrapped in a borrowed coat. She hadn't spoken in hours, staring out the window like she could feel Kepler's presence creeping through the darkness. Then the phone rang. One of the deputies picked up. Paxson Police Department. Silence. Hello? A breath. Slow. Methodical. Then a voice. "You should have let me finish the game." The deputy's face went pale. Meyer heard it. Her breath hitched. Kepler, he was taunting them. He was watching, and that meant he was coming back. The final hunt begins. Donahue's radio crackled. "Sheriff, Kepler just called the station." The team went rigid. "He's taunting Meyer," the deputy continued. "Said we should have let him finish the game." Donahue's face darkened. "Did we get a trace?" "Not long enough. But we know one thing." "What's that?" The deputy hesitated. "Kepler said he's coming to finish what he started." Hank's blood ran cold. Meyer was still in danger. Kepler wasn't running. He was hunting. And the next target was the one who got away. Chapter 9. Justice in the Wild. August 26, 1991. Paxson, Alaska. The station was locked down. Deputies patrolled the perimeter, rifles in hand, their eyes darting toward every shadow that stretched across the dirt lot. Inside, Meyer sat stiffly in the corner of the room, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Kepler had called. He was coming. Sheriff Donahue stood by the radio, gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles went white. "We need every available unit on high alert. Roadblocks, patrols. We're not letting this bastard slip through again." Hank paced near the window, every muscle in his body tensed. He didn't belong in a police station. He was a trucker, not a cop, but that didn't matter now. Kepler had already taken too many women. He wasn't taking Maya, not tonight. The question was, how the hell was he getting here? His plane was gone. His lodge was compromised. He was out in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back. Unless, Hank turned sharply, he's been out there for days. No supplies, no food. If he's coming back, he needs transportation. Donahue exhaled sharply, which means he'll steal a car. One of the deputies radioed in. "Sheriff, we just got a report. Truck stolen near Denali Highway, about 15 miles out." Hank's heart pounded. Kepler was closer than they thought, and he was coming straight for Maya. Donahue wasted no time. "We take the fight to him. Set up a roadblock on the highway. We catch him before he ever gets near town." The deputies moved fast, setting up barricades on the only 2 roads leading into Paxson. A handful of officers remained at the station, guarding Maya. Hank clenched his jaw. "This bastard's too smart. He knows we'll be waiting." Donahue nodded. "He won't come in guns blazing. He'll try to get in another way." And that's when it hit Hank. "He won't take the road." Donahue turned to him. "What?" Hank grabbed the map off the desk, his finger tracing the dense forest surrounding Paxson. "If I were him, I'd take the back way, the hunting trails. He knows this land better than any of us. He's not walking into a trap, he's sneaking around it." The sheriff exchanged a look with the deputies. He knew Hank was right. Kepler wasn't a reckless killer. He was a predator, and predators knew how to stalk their prey. The standoff in the trees. Armed with rifles and flashlights, Donahue, Hank, and a small team of officers headed into the woods, following an old game trail that cut around the main road. The trees loomed tall, their branches blocking out the last bit of fading light. Every step felt heavier. Every crack of a twig sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Hank's system. Then, a sound, a branch snapping. They froze. Donahue motioned for silence, raising his shotgun. The undergrowth rustled. And then, emerging from the darkness, came a figure. Kepler. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with mud and blood, but his eyes, his damn eyes, were calm. Cold, like he knew he would make it out of this alive. He lifted the stolen rifle in his hands, a twisted smile creeping onto his face. "Miss me?" he murmured. Donahue didn't hesitate. "Drop the weapon, Kepler." Kepler laughed. Not a wild, unhinged laugh, a quiet, measured one. Like this was just another part of his game. Hank's pulse pounded in his ears. He could see it. The tension in Kepler's fingers, the way his body leaned slightly to the left. He was about to run, or worse, fire. Hank did the only thing he could think of. He lunged. The gunshot cracked through the trees as he slammed into Kepler, knocking the rifle from his hands. The force sent them both crashing to the forest floor, rolling through dirt and roots, fists swinging wildly. Kepler was strong, too strong. His knee drove into Hank's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. In a flash, he was on top, his hands wrapping around Hank's throat, squeezing. Hank's vision blurred. His lungs screamed for air. Then another shot. Kepler jerked, his grip loosening. He slumped forward. Behind him, Donahue stood, rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. For a second, no one moved. Then Kepler let out a slow, ragged breath and laughed. Even bleeding out, he laughed. "Game's over," Donahue muttered. Kepler's lips curled into a sick grin. "I always win," he whispered, and with that the light left his eyes. Kepler was dead, for real this time. Back at the station, Maya sat frozen as the radio crackled to life. "Suspect down," Donahue's voice confirmed. "It's over." The words hit her like a tidal wave. She covered her mouth, tears slipping down her face, her body racked with silent sobs. It was over. For the first time since that night in the woods, she could breathe. Hank leaned against the truck, rubbing his sore ribs as Donahue approached. "You all right?" the sheriff asked. Hank exhaled, nodding. "Yeah." The truth was he wasn't sure, because even with Kepler dead, he knew one thing for certain. Maya wasn't the only one who had been hunted. There were more, and while they had stopped one monster, there would always be others. Chapter 10. The Girl Who Got Away. August 28, 1991, Paxson, Alaska. The morning sky was washed in soft hues of pink and grey, the first light creeping over the horizon. The air was still, as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath. Outside the small police station, Maya Reynolds stood wrapped in a thick coat, staring out at the open road. It stretched into the distance, cutting through the vast, endless Alaskan wilderness. She had made it out. She was alive. But the weight of it all still pressed down on her chest, like she was waiting for something or someone to jump out of the shadows. Beside her, Hank took a slow sip of coffee, watching the quiet town stir awake. It had been 2 days since Kepler had died in the woods. 2 days since the nightmare had finally ended. At least, that's what everyone kept telling her. But Maya knew better, because the truth was, it would never really be over. The fallout. The discovery of Kepler's burial sites had rocked the state. The media had descended on Paxson like vultures, broadcasting every grim detail, his hunting lodge, the cabin, the maps, the bodies. He was no longer just a killer. He was legend. The butcher of the wilderness, they were calling him. The man who hunted women. The headlines painted him as some kind of ghost, a shadow that had haunted the Alaskan wilds for years, taking victims who were never meant to be found. But Maya refused to let them turn him into a myth. He wasn't some untouchable phantom. He was just a man. And he was dead. A survivor's burden. That morning, Sheriff Donahue sat across from Maya in his office, rubbing a hand over his face. The FBI's wrapping up their case, he said. They'll be reaching out about official statements. Maya nodded, gripping the edge of the desk. And the bodies? They'll be returned to their families. He hesitated, then added, as many as we can find. Maya swallowed hard. She had seen the grave sites. She knew how many X's had been on those maps. They would never find them all. And that was the part that haunted her most. Kepler hadn't just killed. He had erased people, as if they had never existed at all. A choice to make. Later that afternoon, Hank sat on the hood of his truck, staring at the empty road. He had been thinking about leaving town, heading back to the quiet life he had known before all of this, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way Maya had looked at him when she asked if it would ever stop hurting. Or maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees at night, whispering the names of the lost. He had stumbled into this horror by accident, but now he wasn't sure he could walk away from it. Maya appeared beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "You thinking about leaving?" Hank sighed. "Thought about it." She nodded slowly, looking toward the road. "Me too." But neither of them moved, because deep down they both knew the truth. Some scars never fully heal, and some ghosts never leave. Epilogue, The Last Move. October 31st, 91, Fairbanks, Alaska. The snow had come early that year. Maya Reynolds stood outside a roadside motel, the neon vacancy sign flickering behind her. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, staring at the empty road stretching into the Alaskan wilderness. The world had moved on. The headlines had faded. The manhunt had ended. Kepler was dead, shot down in the woods. Sheriff Donahue had put the last bullet in him, the muzzle flash burning through the darkness as Kepler collapsed onto the forest floor. His twisted smile had remained even as the life drained from his eyes. He never fought back. He never ran, because that had been the plan all along. In the weeks after his death, the truth had begun to unravel. Kepler had never been a lone predator. He had been one of many. Investigators found hidden compartments in his cabin, journals, ledgers, and coded messages. The records didn't just detail his kills, they chronicled a network, connections to other men who hunted like him, names, locations, a system that operated in the shadows, where the wilderness was their playground and the missing stayed missing. But the most chilling discovery? Kepler had known his time was up. He had let them catch him. He had walked into the final standoff in those woods with full acceptance of his fate, not to escape, but to die as a distraction. His death had never been the victory they thought it was. While the world focused on his corpse, the others had moved on, untouched, unseen, ready to continue. The envelope. The letter arrived that morning, slipped under Maya's motel door. No return address, no postmark, just her name. Inside was a Polaroid. It was a picture of Kepler. Not dead, not lying in the dirt where they had left him. This was a different photo, one taken before. He stood among others, faceless figures in the shadows behind him. There were more. Maya's breath hitched as she flipped it over. 4 words. The game never ends. Her grip on the Polaroid tightened. Kepler had planned to die, and now whoever he had died for was ready to take his place.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.